Your body is currently conducting a microscopic symphony. Minute by minute, it releases precise pulses of cortisol, a hormone adjusting to every stressor, meal, and change in light. But when that system breaks down, the medical solutions we offer fail to capture that complexity. Today, we are looking at an article from My Adrenal Life titled Common Myths About Adrenal Insufficiency. The piece tackles the frustrating gap between textbook medical reassurances and the actual physiological reality patients experience.
That gap is profound. The article highlights 3 pervasive myths that patients encounter, even from medical professionals. The first is the idea that taking replacement medication acts as a perfect cure. The second assumes laboratory tests provide a complete picture of a patient's health. The third is the misconception that an adrenal crisis, a life-threatening medical emergency, always presents in a sudden, uniform way.
Let us look at how we even got to this baseline assumption that medication solves everything. We have to look back at the history of the disease itself, because the context of its discovery shapes how it is treated today. British physician Thomas Addison first described this condition in 1855 while working at Guy's Hospital in London. At that time, it was primarily caused by tuberculosis destroying the adrenal glands. He observed patients suffering from severe fatigue, weight loss, and characteristic skin hyperpigmentation. Back then, it was universally fatal. There was no treatment. It was not until the late 1940s and 1950s that scientists developed synthetic cortisone. That discovery was a monumental leap. It changed adrenal insufficiency from a death sentence to a manageable chronic illness. Today, the most common cause in developed nations is not tuberculosis, but autoimmune destruction, where the body's immune system mistakenly attacks the adrenal cortex. Because that transition from a fatal disease to a treatable one was such a medical triumph, it created a lasting narrative. The assumption became that since we can replace the missing hormone, the problem is solved. The article points out the phrase patients hear constantly: just take your meds and you will be fine. But the human body does not work like a simple machine where you just add oil.
The science of cortisol replacement shows why that phrase is misleading. In a functioning endocrine system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis regulates cortisol in a fluid, continuous manner. The hypothalamus senses stress and releases a hormone called CRH. This signals the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which then tells the adrenal glands to produce cortisol. This entire feedback loop operates on a circadian rhythm. Research shows that cortisol levels reach their lowest point around midnight. Then they begin to rise in the early hours, hitting a peak around 8:30 in the morning. Throughout the day, a healthy body releases cortisol in numerous small pulses in response to meals, physical exertion, or illness.
And swallowing a pill cannot replicate that continuous adjustment. What actually happens pharmacologically when a patient takes oral hydrocortisone?
Oral hydrocortisone has a very short half-life in the bloodstream. Studies indicate the biological half-life averages about 90 minutes, though it can range from 40 to over 200 minutes depending on the individual patient's metabolism. When a patient takes a dose, their blood cortisol levels spike within an hour and then drop off. They attempt to replicate a complex 24-hour physiological wave with a few static chemical spikes. Think of attempting to replicate a complex piece of classical music by just hitting a snare drum 3 times a day. You are making noise, but you are not capturing the melody.
That biological mismatch explains the chronic symptoms patients face. Even with the prescribed dosage, a person's energy will fluctuate. Their stress tolerance will vary. It is a physiological reality, not a failure on the patient's part. It seems exhausting to constantly defend your own symptoms to a doctor who looks at the prescription pad and assumes the job is done.
Patients with primary adrenal insufficiency, or Addison's disease, also deal with aldosterone deficiency, which regulates sodium and blood pressure. Those with secondary or tertiary adrenal insufficiency, or iatrogenic cases caused by prolonged steroid use suppressing the natural axis, might only have cortisol deficiency. But in all these cases, the static nature of the medication clashes with the dynamic demands of living. If a patient gets stuck in traffic or catches a cold, a healthy body pumps out more cortisol on demand. A person with adrenal insufficiency must manually recognize that stress and adjust their medication, often guessing at the required dose.
Which brings us to the second myth outlined in the My Adrenal Life article, the reliance on laboratory results as the ultimate truth. Doctors often say, "Your labs look fine," dismissing the patient's lived experience. Why is a standard blood test insufficient for managing the nuances of this condition?
A lab value is nothing more than a momentary snapshot. If you draw blood at 8 a.m., you're seeing the hormone level at that exact second. That number does not reveal the severe drop the patient might experience at 2 p.m. It does not account for the timing of their last medication dose, their current stress levels, or their daily symptom patterns. For diagnosis, endocrinologists use an ACTH stimulation test, injecting a synthetic hormone and measuring how the adrenals respond over an hour. But for daily management, the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases explains that evaluating adrenal insufficiency must include symptoms and medical history alongside those blood tests. The numbers alone lack context.
This over-reliance on static numbers likely contributes to delayed diagnoses. If a doctor only looks at a standard metabolic panel or a single morning cortisol draw, they might miss the underlying endocrine failure until it becomes catastrophic.
The statistics on delayed diagnosis are stark. Research published in the International Journal of Endocrinology analyzed data from patients and found that the time to diagnosis often exceeds several months. In that specific study cohort, 44% of patients were diagnosed only after they were hospitalized for a life-threatening adrenal crisis. Before that crisis, doctors misdiagnosed them with chronic gastric issues or psychiatric conditions because symptoms like fatigue, lack of appetite, and weight loss are nonspecific.
That is a terrifying metric. Nearly half of those patients had to reach the brink of death before the medical system recognized the pattern. It highlights the danger of treating a lab sheet instead of treating the patient.
It exposes a fundamental flaw in how we view chronic illness. We want objective, numeric proof of a problem. But adrenal insufficiency is a functional deficit. You have to measure the function, not just the static substance. The absence of an abnormal lab result on a Tuesday morning does not invalidate a patient who cannot stand up without fainting on a Wednesday afternoon.
That transitions into the third and perhaps most dangerous myth, the idea that an adrenal crisis always looks the same. The classic medical textbook presentation of an adrenal crisis involves severe hypotension, shock, and loss of consciousness. But the article stresses that crisis is a progression, not just a sudden event.
The clinical literature defines an adrenal crisis as an abrupt worsening of health. The mortality rate is serious, estimated at about 0.5 per 100 patient years, making it a leading cause of death for people with this condition. Statistics show that roughly 6 to 8% of people with adrenal insufficiency will experience a crisis each year, but the early warning signs are rarely as dramatic as sudden circulatory collapse. A paper in the National Center for Biotechnology Information outlines that the presentation can vary widely. It might start with subtle cognitive changes, exhaustion, nausea, or abdominal pain.
If a patient or doctor waits for the textbook signs of shock, such as the drastic drop in blood pressure or the confusion, they have waited too long. The intervention needs to happen during that subtle progression. Think of it like a smartphone battery draining. A healthy body is plugged into a charger, keeping the battery full. For someone with adrenal insufficiency, the charger is broken. When the battery hits 10%, the phone does not shut off immediately. The screen dims. Apps start lagging. The system tries to conserve power. Those are the early symptoms.
The physiological progression matches that battery analogy. The Endocrine Society guidelines state that in suspected adrenal crisis, doctors must begin treatment immediately with intravenous hydrocortisone without waiting for lab confirmation. The risk of death is too high to delay. Yet because the early symptoms are vague, patients often second-guess themselves. They might feel dizzy when standing or experience brain fog and wonder if they are just tired. The article from My Adrenal Life emphasizes the importance of patients learning their personal early warning patterns. For a patient with primary adrenal insufficiency, they face a higher risk of dangerous electrolyte imbalances due to the lack of aldosterone. A patient with secondary adrenal insufficiency might present differently because their aldosterone production is somewhat preserved.
The burden of monitoring these patterns falls on the individual. The article suggests tracking energy levels, dizziness, cognitive changes, and sleep patterns over time. This shifts the conversation from a vague complaint to actionable data.
When a patient can show a doctor a written record detailing that symptoms consistently occur at a specific time of day, it bridges the communication gap. Medical professionals operate within strict time limits and structured clinical models. Presenting organized patterns helps the provider understand the functional impact of the disease without requiring the patient to explain complex pharmacokinetics during a 15-minute appointment. Bringing notes that say, energy crashes at 2 p.m. followed by nausea gives the physician something concrete to treat.
It grounds the experience in data. If someone's energy crashes every day at 3 p.m., that is a pattern that can be addressed by adjusting the timing or dosage of their medication. The My Adrenal Life article mentions using specific trackers to organize this data. It validates the patient's experience. If their body does not match the textbook is what needs updating, not the patient.
It is a matter of understanding that the body is a dynamic system. Medical science has provided the tools to keep people with adrenal insufficiency alive, which is a massive historical achievement. But keeping someone alive is different from restoring their physiological equilibrium. Understanding the nuances of cortisol half-lives, the limitations of static lab tests, and the varied presentations of adrenal crises requires ongoing education for both patients and healthcare providers. It requires stepping away from the myths and looking at the science.
It requires acknowledging the limitations of our current medical models. A pill is not a cure, a lab test is not a crystal ball, and a crisis does not always announce itself with alarms. Patients living with this condition are managing a complex, invisible balancing act every single day. The science validates what patients already know. The standard medical reassurances often fall short of the lived reality. If you found this discussion insightful, share this episode with a friend so they can explore these physiological realities alongside us.